Hey everybody, it's the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, and boy, do I feel like an April Fool's joke has been played on me. I talked to one of the techs over at Wells Index today, and he was very helpful. And I was trying to describe over the phone, it wasn't the same guy I had originally spoken to, so I was trying to describe over the phone to him what I was dealing with the broken spindle, and he was telling me about how there were two different versions of the spindle that they had made. And I'm not talking about the 40 taper versus R8 collet. I'm talking about actually the way that the thing goes together. So zoom in here and show you what I'm talking about. So mind you, I was up in my office on the phone talking to this gentleman and didn't have the spindle in front of me, so I was kind of going by memory. You know, the way I was remembering it was I was remembering looking up into the quill after I had taken this section out, and looking up into the quill and seeing this nut. And so when I was talking to him, for some reason I had in my head that this nut had the upper bearings directly above it, and that the upper bearings were like sandwiched between this nut and this nut. And I was asking him about how the preload works on these, because I said, you know, I basically said, yeah, I know how the preload works with the spacer and everything like that. But he explained to me that this outer spacer, when you tighten that big locking nut, that takes care of the preload on the outer races of the bearings through this spacer. This all gets pushed, you know, this can't go up any further into the quill, and so this gets basically squeezed like this. The problem is, and what I didn't realize until I spoke to him today, and then you know, came down here and looked at it and realized exactly what he was talking about. He was explaining to me that on my version, he didn't know what version I had, but he explained to me how the two versions work, and I realized that this is the later version, where this bearing retainer nut right here tightens down when the shaft isn't broken, would tighten down, and this is the nut that actually takes care of the preload of the inner races of the bearing. So when this is all together, basically this nut is what handles the preload of this. So what you do when you're putting this together is you would install this bearing first, then the spacers, then this bearing, then you tighten down this locking nut. That's your preload for the inner races. Then you install this whole spindle into the quill, and you put that big retaining nut with the holes in the bottom back on. And when you do that, that preloads the outer races of these two bearings. The upper bearings, basically what handles that is this other locking nut that goes here. This one here that goes on here. And the inner race can't go any further because there's a diameter change right here from here to here. Now, I guess on the earlier versions, I think it was the earlier versions, he said, there was actually a situation where it was kind of the way they do in the Bridgeport, which is instead of having a step diameter right here, this part right here is actually a sleeve. So what happens is this locking nut doesn't exist on the Bridgeports. What they rely on the Bridgeport is they rely on this upper lock nut to push on a sleeve. It actually pushes on the bearings, inner races, and then the inner races push on a sleeve that then in turn pushes on the inner races down here. So what this all means is, quite simply, that I'm royally screwed, because it's no wonder why this sounds so terrible. These bearings are going to be very noisy and not work correctly at all if we can't get the proper preload on the bearings. And we can't get the proper preload on the bearings because you can't tighten this nut down to preload the inner races because the shaft is broken. Now theoretically, when the drawbar is in here and the collet's in here, and you tighten the drawbar down, and that pulls everything together, theoretically that would make this bearing nut then push on those inner races. The problem is, as we already know, there's no guarantee that this is going to line up perfectly every time. So if this is just, let me just get this in here a little bit. Alright, so for instance, if I take this and I look at how this is supposed to go, it's supposed to go just like this, okay? Well, even this slight turning that I'm doing here, just what would amount to a few degrees in the arc of the circle, would be enough to throw this thing way out of whack. Because that little bit of movement right there, what's happening is that's going to cause this shaft to basically move, this part of the shaft to move away from this part of the shaft a little bit, which is going to have the effect of loosening on the inner races there. So there's no way I can properly get this to run with this shaft. So I need a new shaft. Again, I talked about maybe trying to fix this one. I just don't think I've got the skill to pull it off. So, I mean, it'd be an awful lot of work to do to have it not end up panning out in the end. It'd be a learning experience, I guess. Learning through trial and error. So I don't know. So I put the call out on the Practical Machinist website in the forum there, where you can post that you're looking for parts and accessories for machines. And I put the word out that I am looking for a spindle. Well, I put the word out for a spindle, and then it occurred to me, actually it didn't occur to me, what ended up happening was I got a response from somebody within a couple of days. Good news, the guy got a head. He says to me, he says, geez, he said, you know, I picked up a Wells Index head that I was going to put on a K&T mill as a vertical head. And he said, I never ended up doing anything with that project, so now it's just kind of sitting here. So he says, I'm not sure what model it came off of. He said, I'll take a look at it. Well, a day went by and he checked it out, and of course, probably just like on my Wells Index machine, the model number is on a data plate that's on the column of the machine. He didn't have the whole machine, he just had the head. But he sent me a picture of the head. In the meantime, a couple other guys had mentioned that they suspected that, depending on what head it was, that it may have been interchangeable. So lo and behold, he sends me a picture of the thing, and it ends up being a 8-speed head. There were two versions of the later mills. The earlier mills, like the 55 and the 65 and that, they had heads that were quite a bit different. But the later manifestations of that head, I'm saying like from 1970 on probably, they're basically all the same with a, oh, let me just show you. So what they did over at Wells is they designed this section right here, and they stayed with this design through quite a few different models. And what's different, besides the spindle being R8 or number 40 taper, besides that, the only other main difference is from here up. So these three nuts that I take off right here and can remove everything from here up, what they did was, and actually I think this casting right here, this housing, is also the same. The whole back gear with that little rubber timing belt and pulley, that's the same. This housing I think is the same. I think what actually ends up only really changing is this top cover right here for the variable speed, the sheaves, and the motor spindle. And the other version, the 8-speed head, is kind of like what they have on the Bridgeports, where you have a more conventional belt running in a step pulley, and when you want to change speeds, you would there'd be a lever that would loosen the belt. So maybe this part of the casting would have to be different, because that lever is going to be somewhere probably on this casting. And that would loosen the belt, allow you to change the belt from one step in the pulley to one of the other three. So you have 4 steps in the pulley, just like in a drill press, modern drill press or something like that. And then they call it an 8-speed head because you still get your high and low range here. So you get 4 speeds high, 4 speeds low, 8 speeds. So that's your 8-speed head. Talked to the guy at Wells, and he confirmed what the other guys were saying, which is I should be able to take that guy's 8-speed head, use from here down if I want, and put this onto his head and fix my mill. So of course the big question is, what's he going to want for the head? And the other problem is he's on the West Coast. I'm East Coast, he's West Coast. We couldn't be further apart unless he was on Alaska or Hawaii. So unfortunately, I knew right off the bat we got a problem with shipping. So the question was he going to just sell me the spindle and ship that to me reasonably? Well, he wants to get the thing out of his shop, but he also realizes if he takes the spindle out and sells it to me cheap, he's going to have the rest of the head to have to liquidate anyways. So what he would prefer is he'd prefer if I just take the whole head. So what he's come up with is he's come up with an asking price for the whole head, which if he was local within driving distance from me to go get it, I would probably take him at his offer or very close to it and buy it, knowing full well that I could probably use what I need to use and sell maybe like the extra motor and maybe a couple other components, although if this is so specialized I'd probably have them forever. The motor might sell quickly. Point being is I could probably sell that and then basically get to a point where I'm not paying an arm and a leg to fix this thing. Well, the problem is he figures it for he figures this whole, what he's got is he's got this bracket, this part, this part, this part, all of this. He figures it for 350 pounds. He said he'd be kind enough to take it to his work so they could ship from a commercial location to help reduce the cost. He said he'd also be kind enough to actually make a crate for it, to crate it up so that it could be shipped in a crate, as opposed to just being strapped to the pallet out in the open where something could maybe fall on it, break a handle or something like that. That's all great. I checked with U-Ship, which is an online company that helps, it's a logistics company that helps you try and find reasonable shipping rates. And to ship that head from where he is in California to me is between $600 and $700. So that puts us back in the old, well, gee, if you're gonna spend that much money, now you're back to buying a brand new spindle from Wells Index, which, by the way, I get the exact quote on that today, $813.50 some odd cents plus shipping. So why don't we just call it, that's probably not too bad to ship that there in Michigan. Call it $850 for a brand new spindle. So none of these solutions are really thrilling me. So what he said was, he said, well, if I don't want the whole head to minimize on shipping charges, that's perfectly fine. He'd be happy to take whatever I want out of the head, box it up and ship it to me in UPS, FedEx, or flat rate or whatever. Problem is, he wants the full asking price for the full head. And I understand that, because he realizes that if I take what I need out of the thing, what he's going to be left with, he may never get rid of. Might end up just having to go to the scrapyard. So, unfortunately, that's where we stand right now. I came down here tonight, I'm going to work on cleaning the Vernon lathe a little more, and while I'm at it, I'm just going to kind of take a look here and see if I can't figure out how much of this stuff we could break down and fit into smaller boxes. The problem is, I looked into that too, and again, because of the distance, even if it comes UPS ground, a box 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot with 100 pounds in it will cost $130 to ship ground from there to here. So even if, like from here down, if this weighed under 100 pounds, I mean, I'm looking at, you put it in a 2-foot square box, that there's going to be no protection. It's going to be so heavy it's going to get dropped once and break something. So that's not really a realistic solution. The quill. That's the other thing too. I said, if the bearings were good in his, that'd be great. And he says, quite honestly, he can't tell me if the bearings are good because he hasn't run the machine. And he said, the old timer he bought it off of said it was in good shape, but he said, he doesn't know for sure. So he can't vouch for the condition of the bearings. Because if the bearings were good, then it might be just to, swap this head out with this section out with his section complete. Well, the other reason why we're going to swap it out is because when Wells builds this machine, the quill, well, I get the quill out, but the quill assembly, where it fits in this bore, is actually lapped at the factory for a perfect fit. So if you take a quill out of another machine and you try and put it in this bore, it may be a little too loose, in which case it'll be sloppy, that'll give you a problem, or it may be too tight, which will give you another problem. The point being is that ideally you want the quill to stay with this part of the machine for life. So I can't just have him remove the quill assembly with the spindles and the bearings in it as one component, ship it to, well, I could have him do that. Problem is, if it gets here and it doesn't fit this bore correctly, then I've got to go back and have him ship me this whole assembly. And then we're back to, boy, between the shipping charges on the 2 boxes alone and his asking price for the complete head, even though I'm only going to have him ship those 2 things, it gets real expensive real quick. So, somebody suggested to me I contact Keith Fenner and see if he can't make me a shaft or fix my shaft. I haven't had a chance to do that yet. Mr. Fenner's shop is on Cape Cod right here in Massachusetts. I think I Googled it once, and he's about an hour-and-a-half drive from me. Maybe an hour, 15 minutes. Point is, I'd be willing to drive out there and bring it to him. My concern is how backed up he is. I know people have sent him projects before, and that's the kind of thing where I might end up sending that out to him, and he might not be able to get to it for over a month. I don't know. Plus, I'm sure he's like everybody else. The quicker you want it, the more expensive it gets. Well, I'd like to try and get it done kind of on the cheap. So I would have to be willing to wait longer. So there's no winning in this situation. Not right now, anyways.